Welcome back to another Star Mini Gaming YouTube video. This video I wanted to kind of further expound upon the video by Vince that I will post the link for below, which was about rules as fun, kind of in the whole discussion of rules as written versus rules as intended, and what Vince thought was the best way to approach that kind of situation, which is similar to my own. And I had a bit of a bit of an example that I had personally been a part of and had seen within another wargaming community, and how that was handled, and how if it had really been approached from the same point of view that both Vince and I kind of held, and I tried to argue it initially, that I think everything would have been, I guess, just resolved in a better way. Not that it was resolved poorly. There wasn't really animosity within the community. I just think it could have been resolved even better, especially since in the end, whenever the game designer actually came down and said, yes, this was the intent of the rule, it was exactly what the rules as fun interpretation would have been. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get to that example, which I'll explain further here. So here's the example from the Lord of the Rings game that I mentioned. This is the section on cavalry and shooting, as you can see. And, just to summarize what it says, you don't have to read the whole thing. Basically, whenever you shoot at a cav model, you have to roll a die. There's a 50-50 chance that the arrow hits the mount or the arrow hits the rider. And then at the end it says you must always target the model as a whole. You cannot target either part specifically. And this is in the core rulebook. And in the Lord of the Rings community for a while, there was a pretty big debate. That was somewhat rules as intended versus rules as written, and the only reason that this was really even much of an issue was Legolas is a fairly popular model in the game. Here, well, there we go. Here is Legolas's profile. So, I'm not going to really cover all the game stats in terms of in the bottom left corner over here. This is really unimportant. All that we really care about for the purpose of this is the second half of Legolas's special ability, Deadly Shot. And here we go. It says, alternatively, Legolas, he, can decide to fire just one arrow, but in this case he will hit automatically regardless of objects in the way or if the target is in combat. Now, let us go real quickly back to the initial one. And then it says, right here it says you roll a die if you hit the cavalry model on a 1 to 3 the mount is hit, on the 4 through 6 riders hit. And and it says right above it, it says the mount is treated as if it were in the way of the rider. Now, this is important because in the way was a very specific, and notice how it's all capitalized here, was a very specific thing that you used in the game. There was no such thing as like cover in terms of improving your defense. What happened was if there was a partially obscured model, you would roll an in the way test, which was a 4-up, you passed it, on a 3 or less, you hit the object in the way, to determine whether or not the arrow got past everything in between the target and the shooter. And the question was, does this special in the way test, which is just is treated as if it were an in the way test, and it performs and functions in the exact same way, does this mean that Legolas cannot automatically declare whether he's hitting the mount or the rider? Because on Legolas's profile it says you can automatically hit whatever you want, and then you may automatically hit the target, and then in this one it says you must always target the model as a whole, and you cannot target them independently. And so this really came down to the question of, does this kind of core rule override Legolas's special rule, or does Legolas's special rule override the core rule? And I was in more of the camp that I thought, first off, I can definitely see how either way, if you're purely going rules as written, that you could interpret either one. It really comes down to a question of order of operations, which applies first and which becomes the exception to the rule. And personally, I was on the side that Legolas could target either one because he ignores in the way, and it was saying that, that you take an in the way test to determine whether you hit the mount or the rider. But I could definitely see where the other viewpoint was coming from. I also am of the belief that special rules are designed in such a way that in games, special rules override the core rules whenever they come into direct contradictions, such as Legolas's other special rule that we can see here, Woodland Creature, which basically meant that in the game you normally suffered a movement penalty if you were moving through wooded areas or other kinds of terrain, and if you had Woodland Creature, you ignored the movement penalty whenever you moved through woods. So that was an example of a special rule overriding a core rule. So I was definitely more of the, this is how it was intended to be, was Legolas can hit whichever he wants, he ignores that in the way rule, and others were saying, well, no, his special rule does not override the core rule. It ended up going not my direction, unfortunately, for a while, until finally one of the GW game designers for the game actually spoke out and said that yes, Legolas's Deadly Shot does override the core rule. But that being said, the point of this entire example is merely to further illustrate Vince's point from his original video.